Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar, How Zoning Broke the American City and How to Fix It, hosted by the Maryland Department of Planning in partnership with the Smart Growth Network and Island Press. My name is Jill Lemke, and I serve as the Manager of Engagement and Outreach at the Maryland Department of Planning. I also serve as a member of the Smart Growth Network Steering Committee. The Smart Growth Network is a national alliance of advocates, practitioners, policymakers, and local leaders working towards a shared vision for land use and infrastructure policies and actions that result in healthy, sustainable, equitable, and prosperous communities for all. In addition to hosting webinars, we provide information on effective planning, development, and preservation practices. The Smart Growth Network website is currently undergoing a transition, so please stay tuned for future updates. Today's webinar is one in a series of webinars hosted by the Maryland Department of Planning on smart growth and planning related topics. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted along with past webinars for viewing via the Maryland Department of Planning's website at planning.maryland.gov or by visiting our YouTube channel. The Planning Department's website also provides valuable information on statewide planning initiatives, planning tools, and educational opportunities, and includes links to past and future webinars. We encourage you to subscribe to our newsletter to learn more about our upcoming programs. It is important to remember that the views expressed by the speakers are those of the speakers and not necessarily those of the Maryland Department of Planning, the State of Maryland, or the Smart Growth Network. Viewers of this live event are eligible to receive 1.5 CM credits from the American Planning Association. To receive your credits, visit the APA website, planning.org, to log into your account and search for the name of today's event. You can also search for the event number 928-8643. Following the presentation, we will address as many questions as time permits. You can submit a question at any time by opening the Q&A tool in the Zoom control panel. Now, I am pleased to introduce our speakers for today. Nolan Gray is a professional city planner and an expert in urban land use regulation. He is currently completing a PhD in urban planning at UCLA. Nolan previously worked on the front lines of zoning as a planner in New York City. He now serves as an affiliated scholar with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, where he advises state and local policymakers on land use policy. Nolan is a widely published author with work appearing in outlets such as The Atlantic, Bloomberg, City Lab, and The Guardian. He lives in Los Angeles, California, and is originally from Lexington, Kentucky. Takara Nicole Thomas, AICP, is the Director of Land Use and Development at Smart Growth America. Her role includes leading the Form-Based Codes Institute, FBCI, as well as other projects and initiatives. Takara believes that communities should be inclusive and welcoming to all, and she is particularly passionate about housing for all. Takara graduated from the University of Florida with a Master of Arts in Urban and Regional Planning, where as a HUD scholar, she focused on the deployment and maintenance of affordable home ownership in Florida. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Takara. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for that wonderful welcome, Jill, and thank you to Maryland Department of Planning and the Smart Growth Network for having me here today. I am going to talk about how zoning broke the American city and what we can do to fix it, if I can figure out how to work my controls. So before I get started with my conversation, I want to tell you a little bit more about Smart Growth America. We are a national nonprofit headquartered in Washington, D.C., and our North Star is that we envision a country where no matter where you live or who you are, you can enjoy living in a place that's healthy, prosperous, and resilient. We achieve our North Star through our impact model of thought leadership, advocacy, and technical assistance. Our main programmatic priorities are advancing climate resilience and preparing communities for climate change, advancing racial equity, and creating healthy communities. With the Form-Based Codes Institute, which is a program of Smart Growth America, we advance the advocacy of zoning reform through the use of form-based codes. And we do that specifically through our form-based codes classes, our Codes for Communities Technical Assistance Program, and our Form-Based Code Award, which is going to reopen its portal for submissions from late summer, early fall of this year. Not going to go through all of my background. Jill gave me that wonderful introduction. I do want to highlight that my practical planning experience, I've served as planning director at several communities in North California. I've conducted programs in community development, community redevelopment in Florida, and I've worked across the nation before joining SGA, continuing my national perspective. Before we get started, I really just want to level set. Everyone says zoning, that Houston doesn't have zoning. So I just want to get this out of the way before we start. Zoning, Houston regulates the built environment with ordinances and subdivisions. They do have codes, it's just not in the lens of zoning. And now with that out of the way, I really want us to talk about how do we fix zoning? Why does it matter to everyone? And what can we do? If you don't get anything else from my conversation today, I want you to have several takeaways. One, zoning is relatively new in the grand scheme of human development and the way we design our cities and where people live. And the zoning that we know today is intensely focused on auto-oriented, single-family, large lot development, which has excluded people on racial segregation and separation of uses. And when we talk about land use and zoning, we're really talking about a set of interconnected systems. And if you change one thing without addressing any of the other systems, you can have some unintended consequences. And zoning is so widespread in America today that it's going to take a comprehensive nationwide approach to really advance housing for all and to create inclusive, equitable communities. And then finally, the last key takeaway that I want you to take away from this conversation is that zoning as it exists today in America is bad fiscal policy. Now, with that, I want to get into the meat of my conversation. On my screen, you should see a picture of the Greek mythological creature Hydra. I love this image and this cautionary tale when talking about zoning, because right now there is a wave of advocacy for incremental approaches. And incremental approaches are great, especially for communities that are not 100% ready for a comprehensive reform. But I really want us to remember the cautionary tale of the Hydra. When you cut off one head, 2 or 3 more heads popped up, which made it almost impossible to defeat this creature. The only way that Heracles, the hero of the story, was able to defeat the Hydra was that he had to cut off the main head and then cut off each individual head and then burn the monster completely. So with that in our mind, I really want us to think about really comprehensive reform as the key to advancing quality of life for all people in America. And just kind of thinking that when you do these incremental reforms and approaches and you don't continue, you're going to have some Hydra heads pop up. So now we're talking about how zoning broke the American system. This is some really big accusations, and I want to really walk us through of how. Some of the key ways that zoning broke the American city, it made it almost illegal to build any housing type besides single family. The discretionary review process has been used to delay and deny approvals. The intense focus on the separation of uses, which has led to car-dependent sprawl. NIMBYs and community opposition have figured out how to co-opt the discretionary review process to protect the status quo. Federal policies and historically and currently have used traditional zoning to promote segregation and inequality. Large minimum lot sizes and an overwhelmingly across the board prohibition on ADUs have forced us into one particular type of housing development pattern, which is not applicable for all community members. Expensive submittal requirements and density controls have arbitrarily worked alongside all of these other implementations to keep communities low density and effectively prevent transit. So effectively, American zoning has made the development of desirable places illegal. From a pragmatic standpoint, it's essentially stolen integrated, people-oriented, vibrant communities from us. And finally, it's just bad fiscal policy and cost us money. Speaking of bad fiscal policy, we conducted a report, Foot Traffic Ahead, where we found that approximately 19% of the total US real GDP is represented with approximately 1.2% of the total land mass of the top 35 US metros. So essentially, approximately 1.2% of American communities that are smart growth, walkable, transit rich, location efficiency are producing 19% of the total US real GDP. Just imagine how much money that could be injected into local communities if all communities had some semblance of smart growth elements. Another report we did, just to really put a fine point on it, sprawl, auto-dependent oriented, low density development cost Americans $1 trillion annually in infrastructure, installation, maintenance, and service delivery. And then conversely, if you follow that point, that train of thinking, when we looked at communities with form-based codes in our zoned in report, we found that they typically generate more tax revenue for local governments. So effectively, when communities are not investigating smart growth approaches, location efficiency, transit rich communities, they're effectively leaving money on the table. And people are willing to pay more for walkable smart growth communities. Another way that zoning has stolen from us, social isolation is now an American epidemic. The US Surgeon General in 2023 highlighted this in his report, Our Epidemic of Loneliness and Isolation. And as a direct symptom of zoning, zoning has stolen third places from us. It's stolen commuting gathering spots. It's stolen diversity and integration. So really, we are more socially isolated today than we've ever been before. And that is a direct symptom of zoning. And then just really thinking about hostile architecture, which is not 100% zoning, but it is also a tool of zoning and is a feature of zoning. In the built environment. I put up this viral quote just recently that occurred. I had to edit it a little bit because the language is a little bit incendiary, but someone took a picture of all of the missing benches in the in New York subway system. And the New York subway system kind of responded, really kind of saying the quiet part out loud, that they took those benches away to prevent the homeless from sleeping on them. And this really intense and perverse feature of American communities, and which is zoning has implemented with punishing the poor, the homeless, and other desirables, has made it hard for all of us. Imagine someone who might be pregnant, or someone who might have an accessibility issue, or someone who might simply just need to have a rest while they're waiting for the subway. Now we're all being punished because we don't want the homeless or another undesirable to use that feature of the built environment. Again, really just putting a fine point on it. Car infrastructure is literally killing Black and Brown Americans disproportionately, and that's by design. In our Dangers by Design report, which was recently released, we found that people of color are more likely to die when walking than any other race or ethnic group. And this is just inequitable and unfair. And again, it is this really fine point of zoning and the intense feature of zoning of punishing others, and all of us are being punished. And again, kind of coming back to this point of we're leaving money on the table, we found that people are willing to pay more via the Foot Traffic Ahead report in communities that are accessible with mobility options and location efficient and mixed use, essentially, and smart growth. And then in our zoned in report, we also found to another gut check is that the number of residents in form-based code areas grew faster than in comparison areas. So between these two reports, we were able to conclude that there is a price premium for these smart growth oriented form-based code communities, and communities that are not adopting at least one aspect, they're leaving money on the table. So now, how can we slay the Hydra? Form-based codes. It is the comprehensive all-in-one regulation to advance that smart growth in that people-oriented communities. But what is a form-based code? It is a regulation. It is not an aspiration. It is not a goal. And I want to read the formal definition so we all can level set, because language is important. A form-based code is a set of land development regulation that produces predictable built results, a high quality walkable public realm, and uses physical form rather than the separation of uses as the organizing principle. And we will share these slides with you afterwards, so I'm not going to read the whole slide. But I really just want to put this fine point of its people-oriented, high-quality public realm. So now some economic benefits of form-based codes, because everything revolves around money in this country, right? Some key points that I want to highlight, and you can access the report on your own. Places with form-based codes generally perform as well or better than comparable areas. They generate more tax revenue, approximately $65 million. Real estate developers love the flexibility and predictability of the approval places versus communities that have zoning. And then places with form-based codes did not experience displacement of existing residents. And while average rent in multifamily developments grew at a slower pace in places with form-based codes than in the comparison areas. So what do you need to include in a form-based code? To have a true form-based code, it needs to align with the standards of practice, and it needs a detailed physical plan and clear vision, a statement of intent and purpose, a building form standard, a regulating plan, clear and objective standards, a pedestrian scale thoroughfare, and then predictable physical outcomes. Two additional points that I want to make before I move on. One, a form-based code lives and breathes with intense and robust, meaningful community engagement. That's how you're able to either walk away completely from discretionary review or relax it, because you've taken the time to really dig deep and formalize the community's vision through the community engagement process. And secondly, form-based code still has uses, it's just not intensely focused on uses as compared to zoning. So now some examples of some good form-based codes. In 2020, Hartford, Connecticut won our form-based code award, and it was a feature of the code was its equity, that inherent equitable measures of the form-based code, and it's a citywide form-based code. Miami 2021 form-based code was one of the first citywide form-based codes, and I always like to highlight that a feature of that form-based code is that they adjusted their parking requirements so that they can focus on infill development to advance housing in their community. And then I want to go through a quick use case. I love this slide personally, because it shows what you can do with a large development that needs to be redeveloped. And we all may know that suburban malls, that pattern is rapidly dying and dying off. So just kind of show you what it can look like over time or all at once. And finally, I want to leave us with this thought. Generations of land use decisions that advance car infrastructure and an intense and perverse desire to harm the poor, the disenfranchised, and the homeless has stolen mobility options, physical health, mental health, and community health from us. Form-based codes can restore people-oriented, fiscally responsible communities. And then this illustration on the side of the screen is just to kind of show how much physical space we've devoted to cars in America today. Some more resources that I've mentioned throughout the slide deck that we can find on the Smart Growth America website are Zoned In Economic Benefits and Shared Prosperity with Form-Based Codes Report, Foot Traffic Ahead, and Dangerous by Design. And finally, when the slide deck is passed around, this has all of my contact information. I would love for you to stay in contact. And thank you for your time and your attention.
Thank you. Nolan, we'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks. Well, thanks so much again to the Maryland Department of Planning for having me, the Smart Growth Network. It's a real pleasure to be chatting with you. Tuning in from Los Angeles, where of course we've solved all of our housing affordability challenges. In all seriousness, it's a real pleasure to be here. I'm now with California YIMBY. We're a statewide advocacy group advocating to make it easier to build housing in California, make California an affordable place to live, work, and raise a family. Takara, I think, really covered, I think, what a lot of us know has gone wrong with zoning policies. I'll briefly cover it, but I'm going to spend the bulk of my talk today talking about some exciting solutions. Just setting the table a little bit, on so many margins, our cities are in crisis. I'm old enough to remember when this was an unprecedented housing bubble. We're now here. And because of this little dip, the discourse has turned to, oh, well, cool, housing prices are falling, the problem solving itself. I think if you take even a remotely broader perspective on the issue, we're not even close to solving this issue, and it's going to continue to be a problem. In so many parts of the country in recent years, we've hit new records for homelessness, definitely not a record we want to be setting. In many regions of the country, it began here in Southern California, but it's now being exported all across the country. Folks are undertaking extreme commutes, super commuters, folks who are spending more than 2 hours in their car every single day commuting. Super commuter might sound good. You don't want to be a super commuter, but we simply don't give people alternative options. We've rapidly stopped making progress on integrating our communities, especially on the margin of racial integration. We've gradually reached a point where we're making almost no progress. Here we are, just slightly over 50 years after the Fair Housing Act, 1968. And this is, of course, especially important, closing the racial wealth gap. There was a lot of discourse when I was writing the book in 2020 about the historically segregationist and discriminatory function of our housing policy. We know that discrepancies in racial wealth are tied up with discrepancies in access to homeownership. And as we've stopped making progress on the latter, we've stopped making progress on the former. To the extent that we still build in the US, we essentially only build in a format that's out and not up. If you want to build a suburban subdivision or a new strip mall almost anywhere in America, we make it very, very, very easy. If you want to build anything in an existing community, we make it very, very hard. A former colleague of mine at the Mercator Center has a joke. Los Angeles' de facto affordable housing policy is Las Vegas. If you want an affordable home in Los Angeles, you just have to move out to the desert. This is true in high opportunity regions all across the country. All across the West Coast, we tell people, well, if you want access to affordable, decent housing, you have to move. Leave your community, your friends, your family behind, job opportunities, schools behind, and move to regions of the Mountain West, exporting the housing crisis. Doing the exact same thing on the East Coast with high opportunity regions like the Northeast, exporting more and more Americans to other parts of the country. This is not sustainable. This is not ethical. The good news is it's a crisis we know how to solve. So is everybody sufficiently depressed? I'm going to spend the bulk of my talk discussing proven zoning reforms. So I'll go through a few here. The first is legalizing apartments near transit and legalizing missing middle everywhere. And I'll talk about what that would entail. I'll talk about eliminating minimum parking requirements, a few examples there. We'll discuss reducing minimum lot sizes, which are really key to creating the next generation of starter homes. Talk about legalizing ADUs, be careful to do it the right way. And then last but by no means least, we'll talk about the need to expand ministerial approvals. So let's dive right in, I think, with a pretty high profile example. In 2019, Minneapolis made history by being the first city to eliminate single family zoning after adopting the policy. As part of a general plan update, they actually did real public process, not public process where we wait and see who's going to show up at a Tuesday 10 a.m. meeting and yell. They went out and got a real cross-section of the community to provide their perspective on what they wanted Minneapolis to look like. And they actually found a lot of buy-in for reviving these missing middle, low-rise multifamily housing typologies that had historically been illegal to build. To the extent we have missing middle typologies, we often preserve them and we take extreme measures to protect them. But in Minneapolis until 2019, as in most other cities to this day, we make these illegal to build. These duplexes, these fourplexes, these small apartment buildings, these townhouses, these were absolutely essential typologies for keeping our communities affordable and diverse. For those, here's the classic illustration of missing middle. by the folks over at Opticos, you can see this whole range of housing that we essentially stopped building for the past 100 years. And that was so key to allowing communities to grow and adapt over time and provide a range of housing options that supported folks at all stages of their lives or for all forms of household structure. For young professionals, for retiring seniors, for large families that want to perhaps live in the same building but have separate units. The revival of missing middle in Minneapolis, in addition to, I think this is a really important part of the story, increases in density along their major transit corridors and along their major transit nodes is partly why they've been one of the only cities in their peer group to actually be solving the housing affordability issue, right? We talk a lot about legalizing missing middle. It's also key that we are legalizing a range of housing typologies, including those apartments over shops along corridors that were historically so key to giving people housing options in places where they could potentially live car-free or car-light. And you can see the proof is in the pudding. Minneapolis went on a building boom tear in the years after this adoption. They actually made significant progress relative to their peer cities on housing affordability. I'm not just seeing rents flatline, but actually fall. And you know, it's easy to talk in terms of numbers, but these are numbers that reflect more and more households perhaps being able to spend their resources on something other than rent. More and more households in a situation where they're not spending a quarter to half of their income on rent. And we can see, you know, Minneapolis in a period when most U.S. cities were dealing with extreme run-ups in rents and thus home prices. Minneapolis, which undertook this, I think, bold step of reforming their zoning codes, saw a lot of progress. Another proven reform is eliminating minimum parking requirements. So I'm out here at UCLA with the great Donald Shoup. For folks who haven't already read, you know, The High Cost of Free Parking, there's a great new book out by Henry Graybar, Paved Paradise, worth checking out. Minimum parking requirements write auto dependents into law. They say that if you do not build at least so much parking, you are not allowed to open a business. You are not allowed to build an apartment building. This makes adaptive reuse incredibly difficult, and it also increases the cost of housing. In 2017, Buffalo and also Hartford made history by eliminating these minimum parking requirements, not reducing them. Many cities had reduced them, or they said in our downtown, we're not going to have them, but everywhere else, all of our other suburbs are going to have loads and loads of parking. Buffalo and Hartford, I think, made really important planning history in 2017 by saying, hey, we're going to let consumers decide how much parking they need. Of course, many households will still demand parking. When Los Angeles removed downtown parking requirements for adaptive reuse projects, we didn't necessarily see a huge reduction in parking, but what we saw was projects being more creative. Maybe they had shared parking. Maybe they rented out offsite parking spaces. And then in some cases, yes, we did get less parking and we saw parking lots being redeveloped. I think the absurdity of these rules is captured by these two graphics, the one on the left here by my friends over at the Parking Reform Network. You can see, right? Standard 2-bedroom, 670 square foot apartment or condo, not glamorous, but exactly the type of inherently affordable housing that we need to be building if we're going to keep our cities affordable. If you are requiring 2 parking spaces per unit or 1 parking space per bedroom, so many cities have these parking space requirements escalate per bedroom, which effectively places an extra burden on family-sized housing. What you're doing is you're requiring this household to consume almost as much space in parking as they consume in living area. And they might prefer that. They might be willing to pay the $30,000, $40,000, $50,000, $100,000 if it requires excavation or a structure needed to provide that parking. But our zoning rules in many cases don't give folks choice. And this is a huge issue, especially in some of our older legacy cities that have experienced significant divestment. In many cases, we have parking rules on the books that don't allow you to reuse parking lots or to reuse historic structures that simply don't have enough off-street parking. Reform and elimination of minimum parking requirements has really gone national. I think this was a sort of fringe, bold issue 10 years ago that now I think is really well established. I'm excited to say even last year, my hometown of Lexington, Kentucky, eliminated minimum parking requirements, citywide, all uses. This is the type of bold action I think we should be taking if we're taking the climate crisis and the housing affordability crisis seriously. A third set of reforms that I think are really important are reforms intended to revive starter home production. When I talk to a lot of affected officials and I say starter home, I think they still imagine a bungalow on a 5,000 square foot lot. But the reality is a starter home in 2024 is going to be a 2-bedroom condo. It's going to be maybe a townhouse. It's going to be a single family home on a 2,000 or 2,000 or less square foot lot. And those are typologies that between single family zoning and high minimum lot sizes or high minimum unit sizes, we often make altogether illegal to build. Houston, I think, actually is a really fascinating example here, just in what they did in 1998. Prior to 1998, Houston, they don't have zoning, but they have a few zoning-like rules. And one of the zoning-like rules that they had was a minimum lot size of 5,000 square feet. They said if you don't consume at least 5,000 square feet of land, you are not allowed to have a home in the vast majority of the city. In 1998, they said, look, this is stopping our ability to create the new forms of housing that we need as land prices go up. It's blocking our ability to more efficiently use our infill land. They lowered the minimum lot size down to 1,400 square feet. And in the following 25 or so years, what this has done is stimulated the construction of 80,000 new infill homes, townhouses, and small lot homes. Of course, absolutely key for keeping Houston one of the most affordable cities in the country, but also key for reducing VMT, for getting people closer to jobs and amenities. This one change that really cost the public sector almost nothing put the city on a much more sustainable course. I like to talk about the small, large, and the missing small housing. We talk a lot about the missing middle housing, right? We also need these smaller forms of land efficient housing that, again, are in many cases illegal to build. Those small lot homes, the boarding homes, mobile homes, tiny home communities. These are the types of inherently affordable types of housing that, in many cases, for example, in the case of boarding houses or tiny homes, might be the housing safety net that keeps people from falling into street homelessness. You might see one of these accessory dwelling units. We'll talk more about that in a minute. You can really see just how this has transformed certain neighborhoods in Houston, allowing for far, far, far more environmentally, fiscally, and I would say socially efficient forms of development that have opened up Houston and other cities that have adopted reforms like this to the next generation of homeowners. Let's talk about those ADUs, accessory dwelling units. This is, I think, another reform like eliminating minimum parking requirements that has gone spread like wildfire over the last few years. So for those who don't know, ADUs, also known as granny flats, mother-in-law units, casitas, these are small additional units that might share a lot with an existing single-family home. They might be in an unused garage or basement or attic. And they're really exciting to my mind because they let homeowners be a part of the solution, and they provide an opportunity for homeowners to potentially have an additional source of income, especially important for retirees who want to age in place. They allow larger families to potentially stay together, again, without not having to overcrowd in an existing unit. But they also provide new rental opportunities, in many cases in neighborhoods that haven't built an apartment in 50 to 100 years. Now, one thing I'll stress here, I talk a lot about legalizing ADUs, and pretty often I'll hear from local planners, oh, well, we legalized ADUs and nothing happened. And I'll crack open their code and I'll see a code entirely full of poison pills that make this totally unworkable. Owner occupancy requirements, parking requirements, a special use permit or some sort of public hearing requirement or a notice requirement or high fees. The vast majority of people applying for ADU permits are either going to be homeowners or very small developers. And any number of regulatory hurdles can scare those smaller types of applicants away. These reforms are happening all across the country. They seem to be most popular in college towns, where I think there really is this need for small rentals, especially near college campuses, where the housing crisis is actually a lot more acute than I think has received mainstream coverage. This is probably one of the most successful land use reforms we've adopted in California. In 2017, after years of trying to get local governments to adopt workable local ADU ordinances, the state essentially finally stepped in and said, okay, we're going to adopt statewide standards for ADUs, and we're going to guarantee the right of every property owner to build an ADU on his or her property. And what we've seen since the laws came into effect in 2017 is approximately 82,000, as of 2022, ADUs permitted. Now, again, we talk in terms of numbers a lot. We talk in terms of abstract figures. Those are 82,000 homes that could not have legally existed just 7 or 8 years ago. Those are 82,000 people who potentially have a home or have an additional place for a family to stay, and a home that was illegal 7 or 8 years ago. Again, as we're talking about how to expand both the housing supply and the diversity of housing options, and particularly in this current time of potentially the next few years of austerity politics, zoning reforms like this offer a bit of low-hanging fruit. They offer free interventions for cities to create a new supply of affordable housing. Some cities in California have really gone above and beyond with pre-approved ADU plans. San Jose, for example, has same-day permits. Getting the process right is so key for ADUs, but also many other small-scale types of projects. If something's theoretically allowed, but it requires a variance, it requires a rezoning, it requires a special permit, it might as well not be allowed for that small local builder who's actually going to be building these units. And that gets me to my last, I think, important intervention here, which is process streamlining. There aren't a lot of happy stories out of LA housing. We still have a lot of work left to do. But one of the exciting things that's happened in the last few years has been Executive Directive 1, massively streamlining permitting for 100% affordable and workforce housing. And there are discussions about extending this to all housing. So what this did was it said, look, we have a lot of great projects that are otherwise completely compliant with the underlying zoning or require only very minor relief from the zoning. Let's get them through the process as quickly as possible. We don't have time to dilly-dally. Nobody benefits from these permitting and entitlement delays. You combine this streamlining with our state density bonus, which offers significant additional density as well as waivers from standards like setbacks or lot coverage or height limits that might preclude the actual use of that density. And what it's done is facilitated over 10,000 units. I have to just say 10,000 plus because every time I give this presentation, the number's gone up by 1,000, 2,000. I think we're close to 14,000 units. Those are 14,000 units entitled, unlocked, again, at almost no cost to the public sector. It was just aligning agencies, getting better coordination, getting folks in the room, and making it clear that there's a shared priority to get these projects, especially these affordable and workforce projects, through the pipeline as quickly as possible. These process streamlining stuff is great. Another variety of this that I'm seeing become more and more popular is more of these pre-approved plans for typologies. Go out and do the work, find out typologies that folks are comfortable with in the community and say, hey, look, if you propose to build something that we've got total consensus is great and is going to be part of the housing and environmental and equity solution, we're going to make your life really, really easy. With zoning policy today, we spend so much time thinking about what we don't want, and we spend no time thinking about what we do want and what we do need. And so I think part of this mindset shift is I think, considering what do we actually want and how we make that as easy as possible to get built. A couple concluding remarks here. Don't have a ton of time, but we will have time for Q&A. What can you do? If you're an elected official or a commissioner, you should be the champion on pro-housing land use reform. Whenever we survey folks now, this is increasingly the top issue. This is the top quality of life issue. I was just talking to a political pollster the other day. He said, historically it was always jobs. Sometimes it would be public safety. Now it's almost always housing. If you are an elected official, you represent people, you have a constituency that you're responsible for. They need you to lead on these reforms. If you're a planner or a developer, be your local policy entrepreneur. Be ready with the solutions that your community needs. It's always tough for me whenever I talk to folks across the country because I don't have the answer. Nobody has the answer. But the locals will know, hey, here are the margins at which these projects are getting tied up. Here are the reforms we could adopt. Here's the project that we could build tomorrow if only we could get the rules straightened out. So planners and developers, you're really the key local experts, and your community is relying on you, I think, to bring the expertise and to socialize some of these ideas. And if you're just a lowly activist like me, ask those folks above what they can be doing on housing. Provide them the support. In many cases, I talk so often to elected officials or commissioners, or I talk to planners who said, hey, look, I had a great project. I love this project, but everybody who showed up at the meeting was complaining about it. It's very hard for me to support it. You got to provide cover for all these other folks in this ecosystem to do the right thing. You got to go out and build the coalitions and talk to maybe unconventional partners like ARP, maybe NAACP, your local habitat. Talk to them, get them turned on this issue, and you'll be surprised by how much you can accomplish. I've been talking about zoning reform, and I do want to say I think these zoning reforms are necessary, if not sufficient. If the housing's illegal to build, it almost doesn't matter how much money we spend or any of these other interventions we make. But once those issues are changed, I think we also have to be careful, one, that we're providing the public support for a steady supply of deed-restricted affordable housing. We can't just mandate affordable housing, which ends up being a tax, and call it a day. There are always going to be households that do need public support, and we need to make sure that we're lining up that public support. We also need to be making thoughtful interventions to ensure that the new density that's coming online doesn't actually lower folks' quality of life. That means smarter parking management. That means better transit. That means safer streets. That means better public services in existing cities. I think if you make cities desirable, this problem starts to solve itself. Okay, didn't have a lot of time, but I wanted to cover some of the highlights there. Some really, really exciting stuff. Just by way of closing, I don't talk about this issue for any other reason than because I think it's highly, highly solvable. We're seeing incredible progress be made on zoning reform, and we're seeing policies that were previously thought sacrosanct now be seriously reconsidered, all to the benefit of the folks who live, work, and play in our communities. So with that, again, thank you to the Maryland Department of Planning, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Nolan. Thank you both for a great presentation that was engaging and enlightening. Throughout the webinar, we have been assembling questions for the speakers from our audience. As a reminder, you can continue submitting questions throughout the discussion, and we will get to as many as we can until 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time. So if the speakers could turn their cameras on, we'll get started. So to kick things off, I wanted to ask, since I represent the Maryland Department of Planning, how can states like Maryland, who have local control of zoning, help local governments in their efforts to reform zoning regulations?
I'll jump in here real quick and then save space if Nolan wanted to throw in anything. I'll say Massachusetts and Washington and California are starting to give really great examples of how states can get into local planning. Washington just recently, last year, I believe, released their suite of zoning laws where it essentially mandated that local communities have to allow a diversity of housing types. They use specifically the terminology missing middle housing, and municipalities have to adopt 6 out of 9 housing typologies offered to them. In addition, they also mandated that the communities must allow ADUs by right. And what also stood out to me about that suite of legislation, they also mandated that they're explicitly allowing them for all residential districts, including suburban communities. That really blew me away, that they were stepping into that fray essentially and telling the local municipalities to go ahead and just allow them. Massachusetts is a shining example as well because of the MBTA legislation, which was part of a wide sweeping zoning reform. That essentially mandated that within, I believe, half a mile of any MBTA stops, the community must allow higher density. And then California just has a suite of zoning reforms related to housing. And they just show as an example of the state stepping in and showing the understanding of the housing crisis and their understanding of how zoning impacts the housing crisis. One more thing I kind of want to add to this, just to kind of wrap it up in a bow. There's some not so great examples. One would be Florida with the Live Local Act. I have several reservations about the state stepping in, mainly with the idea of citing all of the residential affordable housing in commercial corridors, and the language being very vague and effectively stripping the local communities of any type of local control if there are certain thresholds that are reached for affordable housing. So that the way that bill kind of reads to me is essentially there are going to be new concentrations of poverty in low income units and extremely low income units. And while housing across the board is needed and we need supply to come out of the pipeline, just period. I think it needed to be a little bit more thoughtful with the language about where and how those properties were going to be cited, because there are just still some questions. And then to cite a lot of affordable units at one place in a corridor that might not have transit access or access to any other amenities kind of just raises a red flag for me. So just to wrap up, I would say that states should look at California, Washington, and Massachusetts as some examples of how they can get into the fray and maybe stay away from states like Florida.
Thank you. Nolan, did you have anything to add?
I'll just quickly say, I think it's going to be a mixture of carrots and sticks. Part of what we've done that's been really successful in California is there's some things that we just know need to apply statewide. We don't need parking requirements near transit. We need baseline workable ADU standards. We need to have relatively reliable, streamlined permitting. Those are things that we can adopt at the state level. And I think that in many cases, we have local partners thank us for adopting some of these standards and nudging their local elected officials to actually make some of these changes. At the same time, I think you also need support for cities that are doing the right thing. You need to be having more grants for planning reforms. I talked to many cities where they want to undertake, I think, really bold, ambitious reforms. They want to do a big general plan rewrite, but that costs a lot of resources. I think it's got to be a blend. Carrots and sticks. I characterize the former mostly as guardrails. We're just putting up guardrails around local power, and then also providing support for folks who are doing the right thing.
Thank you. This is a question for Takara, but Nolan, please jump in if you have any perspective on this. You mentioned that there is a price premium in form-based code developments, cost premium, price premium. How can we combat the growing housing affordability crisis, especially in areas like North Carolina, where inclusionary zoning is illegal? Is a factor of the price premium due to the higher cost of construction or some other component?
That's a great question. And I'll kind of start with maybe stepping back a step. I would probably say the cost premium is because there's such a constrained supply of these communities that have these smart growth elements or form-based codes or walkable, location efficient, however you want to define them. There's just not enough of these communities to go around. So people want them, they're flocking there, prices are rising because there's constraints, supply, etc. So now to get to the actual question, I would say it's more of a combination of things, as I kind of hinted at during my presentation. It's an interconnected set of processes. Really, it's land, it's lots, it's labor, it's laws. And there's one more L I can't remember. I can never remember the fifth L, but it's like a lot of interconnected inputs that are contributing to this constrained supply, which then contributes to the rising costs, right? So then kind of going back and stepping back, you need to have that comprehensive approach to kind of unlock these lots, encourage workforce development. As we know, we may or may not know that there aren't enough laborers around. There's kind of like an age cliff. Laborers are retiring out, so it's hard to find new one. Younger generations aren't really interested in the trade, so on and so forth. And then when you have such a limited amount of land because of zoning, which has said, keep the math simple. If you have a community which has 100 acres, effectively zoning said you can only have 100 houses on 1 acre in that community. So supply and demand, those are all kind of the factors. And then I remember there was another part of the question. What was the other part of the question, Jill?
Is a factor of the price premium due to higher cost of construction? I think you covered that one. And how can we combat growing housing affordability crises in areas where inclusionary zoning is not legal?
Gotcha. That's a really interesting part of it. Thank you for rereading the question. I wanted to appreciate that. It's going to take combinations of things. As Nolan mentioned, carrots and sticks, changing your zoning, adding other types of programs and being creative, like layering programs. So, just kind of throwing something out, maybe a community can create a community land trust with existing municipal surplus lands, and then working with developers and allowing for alternative housing typologies by right and manufactured housing. And then you could deploy the units faster, streamline the permitting. And that's just something I kind of came up with off the cuff of my head, just to illustrate that it's going to take a little bit of creativity to package some programs and reforms together to address that.
Right. Thank you. Nolan?
I think Takara covered it well. I'm happy to take some of these other questions
Okay.
here.
There's a theme running through some of the questions, so I'm going to paraphrase a little bit. In an era where distrust of government institutions is at an all-time high and political divisiveness is also at an all-time high, what is the best way to overcome entrenched opposition to zoning reforms without fanning the flames?
That's a really great question. I think one of the beauties of this issue is that it's actually not quite so ideologically or partisan polarized as you might think. I think it maybe has been in years past, but today this is such a universally understood issue, and the solutions don't necessarily require you to buy into certain worldviews, right? I mean, I like the quote, there's no Republican or Democratic way to pick up trash. There are communities all across the country that are dealing with a housing shortage, and there are certain shared accepted views on changes that need to happen to address that. We've seen exciting zoning reform in Republican places like Montana, where the discourse was about, hey, how can we store the property rights of homeowners to build ADUs, or restore the property rights of commercial owners to build townhouses or mixed use communities on their properties. Whereas in a place like California, we talk a lot more about sustainability and equity. Is the pattern of growth that we're writing into law making those worse or improving those issues? So talk in terms of people's values, talk in terms of a range of values. I think talk in terms of providing people choice. I think urbanists or folks who support more diverse housing options have framed this in terms of, well, we have to make historical injustices right. We have to respond to climate change. Those things are true, but I think you actually catch more flies with honey than vinegar. I think if you say to people, hey, wouldn't you want to live in a great walkable community where you could afford to live at all stages of your life? Don't you want to live in a community where the folks who are teaching your kids or serving you at the supermarket can afford a decent home? I think when you make that positive appeal to people, people start to get it. They start to realize, oh, actually, I'm gonna benefit and be enriched by this, and that's the approach that we try to take. It's inherent in who we are. YIMBY, yes, in my backyard. We try to take a positive approach to it, and I think also too, in terms of working with elected officials, you go to these public hearings, and there will be a bunch of NIMBYs who are just irate and angry and yelling and upset and fear mongering, and then there are a bunch of YIMBYs, whether they call themselves that or not, saying, hey, look, I think our community would be better and enriched by this project. I think a lot of the folks in the room see, hey, which side do I want to be on? I want to have a positive vision for the future of our community. But it does take the work. Sorry.
Jill, can I jump in and add a yes and?
Yes.
I totally 100% agree with Nolan, and I'll add to it just kind of like more, we're all human, and just kind of keeping that in our minds and how we approach people and language, etc. And then, being creative. This one example I love is an artist, Candy Chain. She was based in New Orleans, and she saw a bunch of vacant lots in her community. And as an artist and an urban planner, she took it upon herself. She put up these kind of like billboards and invited the community members to create almost their own visioning process. And there was a prompt that said, I wish this was. And so that just kind of grew and became like this impromptu art installation. And then she took it upon herself to take the findings back to her city council meetings. And then that was wrapped up into formal planning processes. So I like that anecdote as a way to appeal to planners to be creative and really lean into the community, the meaningful part of community engagement, meeting people where they're at. And a quote that stuck with me since business school was, build the well before you need it. So before you even bring up the Z word, or you start thinking about that maybe we need to do zoning, you start that community engagement. And South Bend is a really great, South Bend and Minneapolis actually are two great examples of this, because they started their community engagement and their community outreach years before they actually put pen to paper. So South Bend did a series of community workshops, met people at laundromats, so on and so forth. And Minneapolis kind of did the same thing. They would put out a program, get community feedback, create a feedback loop, and then eventually all of that feedback was compiled and wrapped up into their comprehensive plan update. So those are just like two recent real-time examples of kind of taking that mindset that Nolan outlined, and keeping in mind that we're all human and we all live in a community of some sort, and reaching out to people before we need to start putting pen to paper and writing.
Yes, that's beautiful. Thank you. I have another question. I believe this is for Takara, because you mentioned the role of form-based codes and the minimization of displacement. Can you elaborate on the link between those two things, between form-based codes and displacement?
Yes, great question. And I would say the link is form-based codes kind of creates opportunities, especially in the realm of redevelopment and keeping properties in use, because we really care about, not care about, but it's more of a focus on the form of the building versus the use. So that lends itself a lot easier to redeveloping properties so that it can keep cycling over, right? But then bringing it back down to that mindset of displacement. So that's like a more practical, the buildings stay in use, people can use them, they turn over quickly, etc. But then displacing people and ensuring that displacement doesn't occur. I think that kind of goes back to the community engagement portion of it, right? You really have to have strong community engagement as a through line before you start drafting your form-based code and throughout the life cycle of your form-based code. And then that community engagement reminds people that they are members of that community. So it kind of makes it a little bit harder for that displacement to occur because people feel ownership of their community at that point. Like we go from that top down government type of management to more participatory community engagement. And so that supports that inherent anti-displacement.
Thank you. Next question sort of veers a little bit to some of the solutions that we've been talking about today require more land coverage, which is detrimental to the environment because it increases the number and acreage of impervious surfaces and consequently stormwater runoff. What are the best ways to follow your recommendations but keep minimal building footprints while also providing green space for people to use and enjoy?
Yeah, I'll take a whack at that. I mean, so I think the absolute best thing we could do for the environment on almost every margin is to make it easier to build in existing urban areas and existing cities. Now, that said, we absolutely need urban green. I think we need interventions to support urban tree canopy with street trees. In many cases, redevelopment can be an opportunity to require the installation or the replacement of street trees, as the case may be. We need to be making significant investments in parks. I would say that we need to have standards for impervious surface, incentives for folks to use impervious materials, incentives for folks to have on-site stormwater management for certainly larger projects. All that said, I think the paradigm of zoning is we're going to mandate lots and lots of open space everywhere. And everyone's going to be surrounded by lawns and open space. And sometimes I see that justified on the basis of protecting impervious surface. But what that ends up doing is it ends up sprawling out our cities even further and requiring more roads and more driveways and more larger homes that ultimately will exacerbate the issue. So, I would say, to recap here, fund and make smart interventions in parks and green space. I think it's absolutely essential. Have incentives where you can to use pervious surfaces, but also understand that there are environmental benefits to maybe having a lot of high lot coverage homes in existing urban areas where people can walk or ride or take a bike. Yeah, thanks for the question.
Thank you. Takara?
Yeah, my bite at the apple, kind of a little bit different mindset. It's more about infill and redevelopment when you kind of grow in and use what's already existing. So if you're growing in that existing urban area, you already have that infrastructure laid, you already have access to transit, so on and so forth. So you're using less building material, you're using less lot coverage ostensibly, things of that nature. So you're using already what you have, which is a lesson that we learned through the Great Depression, but somehow over the last couple of generations have lost. It's always better to use what's already existing. And infill development, accessory dwelling units, missing middle housing, which are all elements of form-based codes, so they can be approached incrementally or comprehensively with a form-based code. They all kind of wrap into that same mindset. And then for a more specific example, Smart Growth America, our CEO and president, Calvin Gladney, in partnership with the SGA board member, wrote a really great blog post about decarbonization and green banks, which kind of extends that a little bit further. I would recommend it for everyone. We'll try to make sure we get it shared out throughout with the materials. But really the main thesis is that using what you already have is the best and easiest way to decarbonize the environment, because you've already spent those carbon credits to speak, right? And so reusing it will use less, and we can apply that mindset to the built environment across the board.
Right. Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. Um, for small communities, perhaps rural communities where there are high rents of short-term rentals that are driving up the cost of housing, and I'm sure in some urban areas, there are also issues in some neighborhoods with short-term rentals, taking what would normally be affordable apartment rentals. How do we alleviate concerns that ADUs will become short-term rentals? And would you say requiring owner occupancy is a poison pill for these areas as well? And there was another question that asked you to explain a little bit more about why the owner occupancy requirement is a poison pill.
I'm off camera. I'm off mute, so I'll take a first whack at that one. I would say again, we have to step back and kind of think about how the entire you have tools. Tools are tools are tools. Any tool can be used for any reason, right? So kind of that mindset. And then within a housing market, short-term rentals are so disproportionately impactful because we only have one, for the most part, ostensibly housing product on the market, right? So the typical community will just have single family large lot development. So when then you start adding short-term rentals with a housing market that's already supply constrained, and maybe the growth is outpacing the existing housing stock, and then you add short-term rentals to that, which could be used for another use, you're starting to see the housing market implode. So on the face of it, short-term rentals are not necessarily a bad thing when they're unregulated and run away and are added to a weak or constrained market. That's kind of where you're starting to see those issues. So then now how do you address it? Expanding your housing typologies that are on the market and expanding supply across the board. And I think Nolan mentioned it earlier, carrots and sticks, that's going to be a key way to start unlocking those housing supply and allowing for that mixed use, a variety of housing typologies in all residential neighborhoods. Stopping the single family only districts is really going to be a key way to attack that.
Thank you.
Yeah, from the California experience, we've studied how people use ADUs. About half of ADUs are rented out to folks who are not part of the household. Because ADUs are so inherently affordable to build, they are generally rented well below market rate for a comparable new 1 or 2 bedroom unit, as the case may be. Many, I think about 15%, as if I remember correctly, are rented out to friends or family for the low rent of $0.00. And then roughly, 8% or so are used for short-term rentals, with the remainder being used for guest houses or spaces. Now, of course, as somebody who's concerned with housing affordability, I'd like to see every single one of those units being rented out. But folks have different needs at different stages of their life. The issue with an owner occupancy requirement is, one, it makes these projects harder to finance, because if a bank has to repossess the property, they're not going to be able to rent out that ADU and recoup some of the costs. So it can make these projects harder to finance, certainly for new build, maybe with ADU built in, potentially a concern. And we know that this is a big issue because HUD has changed rules in, I think, just the past few months, allowing homeowners to estimate future rents in underwriting a mortgage or underwriting a loan for an ADU. So again, if there's an owner occupancy requirement, if there's life circumstances change, they have to move with family, they have to rent the unit out, maybe they have to travel for work for a year, they suddenly then can't rent out their ADU, they have to evict their tenant. Most folks will look at that and say, I'm just not going to bother with it. I'm not going to waste my time. The flexibility, I think, is really, really key. So to Kara's point, I think, yeah, you need prudent regulations on short-term rentals, but I think holding ADUs hostage, I think, is probably the wrong approach. And get those smart ADUs. Look, somebody can be inconsiderate in an existing single-family home. If there's demand for short-term rentals, they're probably going to either do that in an existing single-family home or a rental or an ADU. This is where other rules and regulations are going to have to come into effect. And I would say don't cut your ADU program short trying to deal with that issue. Have other rules that address it.
Right. I really appreciate that, having grown up in Buffalo, New York, where the predominant housing type is single, what appear to be single family detached homes, but are actually doubles and triples. And so young people buying their first home often gravitated to the doubles so that they could live in one unit and rent the other unit. And that would help them pay the mortgage. So I definitely appreciate that sort of flexibility of ADUs, but also there are some historic examples of where that has worked. And a lot of those houses came about by the need to have housing for extended families that were immigrants. And I think that is still true today. The next question is mainly for Nolan. I wouldn't normally ask a question that's specific to a single state, but this question also pertains to Maryland, so I'm going to ask it. What are your thoughts about the state of California's bill, which Maryland also had a similar bill, that limits local agencies from imposing parking requirements in projects that are within a half a mile of a major transit stop? Do you see this as a step in the right direction? And do you see this as a way to influence people to depend more on multimodal transportation options?
That's a really, really great question, and thanks for asking it. So AB 2097, that was a bill that California YIMBY sponsored, and we were proud to have shepherded that through. It took a few years to get consensus, but we're happy to have gotten it through. And I would say the bill author, former Assemblymember Laura Friedman, was just won her primary and is likely going to go to Congress. So for the electeds in the room, you think that touching parking is third rail. Very much not so. I think she actually built a base of a lot of urbanists and housers who appreciated her and supported her moving forward. To the actual question about the policy, I think it's a no-brainer. If folks want to build parking, they can pay for it. They can make that choice. Developers, the incentives are aligned. If they need parking to make a project work, they will build it. But in so many parts of California, as across the country, there are many neighborhoods where folks might choose to live car light or car free, and we make it illegal to provide housing for them. We mandate the construction of parking lots and parking garages. We destroy the urban realm in the vicinity of our transit, making it unpleasant for the folks who do walk and take transit to those areas. And then it just wastes these billions of dollars that we spent on transit by having projects completely surrounded by new development that's completely built around the car. So AB 2097 said no more parking requirements within a half mile of transit. You know, there are a lot of things where it does make sense to let locals make decisions and trade-offs, but this was one where, you know, there really was a clear best practice planning reform that needed to happen. We were excited to get it through. I'm already hearing from developers. They're saying, hey, look, a project that was not feasible 2 or 3 years ago is now feasible. A project that would have required me to build a giant parking garage or reserve half the lot for a parking lot can now go forward. I'm now able to build apartments over shops. I'm rebuilding that public realm around our transit and potentially increasing transit ridership that's bailing out our transit agencies at a really key time when it's unclear what's going to happen with transit ridership. So to my mind, you know, I think there are arguments to remove parking requirements citywide for all uses, but if you're starting with this reform, there are some places where it's like it's really a no-brainer to stop mandating tons and tons of parking near transit.
Right. Hikara?
If I'm my mute button. I think Nolan covered it very well. I don't have
Okay.
anything for once.
Thank you. I do have a follow-up question that's more general. How do you respond to opponents who say that getting rid of parking minimums will increase traffic?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, if we're concerned about the relationship between parking and traffic, the margin on which you fix that is to have smarter on-street parking management. You know, and the reason why we got minimum parking requirements is that there was a lot of demand for parking, and we didn't want to apply prices to on-street parking to encourage people to consider the trade-offs, and so we just mandated loads of it to be built off-street. I would suggest folks check out the work of Donald Shoup and say, hey, look, we can actually have smarter management of our on-street parking. We can have dynamic pricing that reduces this incentive to cruise for parking, or that would provide developers with some incentive to build less parking that is necessary and to offload those costs into the public realm. You know, this is, to me, I talk a lot about removing parking minimums, but equally important is the second step, which is smarter on-street parking management. Setting up things like parking benefits districts where you say, we're going to establish reasonable prices for on-street parking, and we're going to invest all of that money back into the community, better sidewalks, better public facilities, better parks, better street canopy, et cetera. So it's important. It's a multi-step process, and I would encourage folks to check out some of Donald Schu's work on it.
And I'll add to that just data. That didn't come throughout my presentation too clearly, I fear, but data and knowing your audience is always going to make the case. Trying to appeal to morality or common sense or the climate might not always track, but when you do those parking demand studies and you show that, oh my gosh, we paid all this money for surface parking lots and they sit empty 90% of the day, things like that, that really brings the point home. And then an anecdote from my early career, I was working at a redevelopment agency, and it's a waterfront community. The marina had a community center on the waterfront with some surface parking lot. We did the plan where we were going to redevelop it and put mixed use building on the waterfront with limited parking. Our community members were very concerned and let us know that that was unacceptable. We went through the parking demand management and we showed them the data and we showed them the money that was being lost to maintain that surface parking lot versus what they could get and what that fiscal benefit was. The conversation shifted. So always having the data and knowing the story of your community and being able to speak to that and tell it clearly is going to help your case. Yes. And just remember that sometimes while 100% agreement is always the goal, really want to get consensus, right? So that 80% is your sweet spot. There might be some squeaky wheels that come and they're regular and they're always going to be very vociferous, but getting the majority of your community out and getting the true voice of the community versus just a few, I like to call them high flyers from my time when I was on the other side of the dais, it's going to be more equitable and you're going to get a better picture of what your community really wants.
Thank you. Like you said, follow the money. We have a lot of people who participate in the webinars who are from rural and suburban areas. And there's some questions about how do we apply these examples to more suburban or urban areas that may or may not, that in all likelihood do not have viable transit options.
So at least for form-based codes, they apply at all scales. And that's where your community vision really comes in. So the graphic from Opticos that Nolan shared on his screen, where it kind of shows that gradient of how you can go from the single family suburban rural format all the way up to the higher density, more finer grained community street pattern. That always really helps with the conversation. And then really just kind of showing them to calibrate to your community, this is what we're proposing. We're not necessarily proposing this high-rise tower next to a suburban ranch, right? And then when you do the community visioning process, you really drill down into what your community members want. So then pairing up that vision to the code. So then you articulate what the community wants with the written document. So it's really just kind of like a listening exercise and then that iterative feedback loop and really making the fine point that we're applying this to the community character, existing community architecture vernacular, and not necessarily proposing something that doesn't fit.
Right. Yeah, I'll just quickly say, I think allowing for communities to grow and flexibly change is just as important, probably more important in suburbs than in cities, suburbs that have been locked in a straitjacket where we have one housing typology and folks are in a situation where they really can't get anywhere without a car. I think flexibility of land use is probably most important in that context, and certainly very important in rural communities where land use demand and need might be changing over time. Having a set of rules that really focus on dealing with those negative externalities, those impacts, is important. But reckoning with some of these rules that lock cities into one form, suburbs and rural towns and smaller communities into one form of development, I think really limits their possibilities.
Thank you. I'm going to switch gears a little bit, I think. A frequent argument we hear against increasing density is that existing neighborhoods don't have the infrastructure it needs to accommodate an increase in population. In Maryland, we have adequate public facility ordinances, which are sometimes used as a reason not to provide affordable housing options. Sometimes this is exaggerated, but often is pointing to a real problem, such as overcrowded schools or the need to provide additional water and sewer. What can local governments and citizens do in these types of situations to address both concerns in terms of infrastructure that is needed, as well as the housing that is needed in order to make a affordable, livable, walkable community?
Well, the first thing that's resonating with me is that typically infrastructure is overbuilt. The standards will make it so it has to be to a standard that's higher than what we anticipate the density is going to be. So then going back to that data and knowing what your infrastructure can actually support, and communities are always doing these types of calibration routinely. So having that data in hand and making sure that what you're proposing is aligned with that. Now, an area of caution could be in suburban areas where they have septic. That would definitely need a very intense investigation of what the community, the infrastructure can support. And then as far as like the school infrastructure, I do kind of want to touch on that one. That kind of goes back to processes and, to be frank, racism. The way that we currently manage school districts and school busing and school facilities planning kind of goes back to desegregation and school busing. And a lot of times you try to follow suburbia. So they'll build schools when suburbs come out and then mothball inner city or other schools. So kind of just reframing that a little bit. And it goes back to the question, are we using these facilities to their highest and best use? And are we maintaining them properly? So at least for the school facilities. But then kind of going back to infrastructure overall, having that data and making sure that what is being proposed aligns with the current standards of the infrastructure will help assuage that concern.
Yeah, I'll add a couple of points to this. So first, Dakar is exactly correct. A lot of communities are slightly overbuilt, especially as maybe, for example, some of these suburban communities have smaller household sizes than they have historically. For most of what we've talked about over the course of this talk, ADUs and missing middle townhouse infill, the margin at which you need to build to make communities affordable and equitable and sustainable again is really not going to be the margin that bumps projects into requiring entirely new infrastructure. That said, there are many cases where that's going to be true, and I think the question is, are we going to take an approach of no development except where we have the infrastructure to supply it, or growth is coming, let's make a plan to actually expand the infrastructure. Cities retain rights in most of the country to charge reasonable exactions and impact fees and to share that cost and to pull from existing general revenues to pay for that in additional infrastructure. And that's, I think that's planning, right? That's classic planning. It's projecting forward and saying, what's the growth that's going to come to keep our community healthy? What investments do we need to be making now? We did it in past generations, and we have just as much of an obligation to do that work today. And I think one of the arguments that I try to make in the book is, to the extent we've totally rebuilt American planning around zoning, around managing, what happens in the private realm, around stopping growth. To my mind, I think there's lost wisdom in the way that we approach planning historically, which was, how do we create a flexible framework where growth and change that's positive can happen and is supported and reinforces public investments rather than the other way around. So thanks for the question.
Thank you. This is a question someone has asked about a community where they live that has enacted reforms in their zoning. Unfortunately, they state, our budget for active transportation infrastructure is limited, and the state doesn't designate enough money to our regional transit service for it to be efficient. How can we ensure housing development comes with human-centered transportation at the local level?
I came off mute first, so I'll take a crack. Look at the IRA and IJA and the I think it's the Build Back America. Anyway, the most recent federal suite of funding have a lot of funding that's directly tied to housing production, and there's some funding that's tied to transit and technical assistance. So it's, some of it is not going to be direct funds. It could be technical assistance so that you can prepare for changing your zoning so that you can usher in these reforms. And then some of them are going to have a little bit of creativity because they have like coalitions that can apply for these funds, or it'll be a nonprofit or things of like that nature. But I definitely would say check out the federal funds right now. The Biden Harris administration has a very keen interest in unlocking zoning so that housing can come out of the ground. And they've been tying a lot of funds around that to advance it.
Nolan, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'll just say absolutely. We need to be having the public support kick in. There are many in almost every community in America, though, there are already contexts where folks can live car light or car free, whether that's because they're walkable or bikeable, or because there is some basic bus or rail transit. So to my mind, we actually do have a lot of underutilized capacity. It's not always true, always and everywhere. But that's where I would look in the meantime and continue to advocate for more investment.
Great, thank you. There's a couple questions here, and I don't know if we covered it previously, but I want to touch on it again. I think there's a little bit of a misunderstanding about the impact that adding density will have on green infrastructure, and in particular on tree cover and tree canopy. Trees are often cited as a benefit for climate, reducing the heat island effect and such. How do we make sure that our development patterns aren't coming at a cost to greening? And is it a either or is there a balance that can be achieved?
It's a great question. I think it's a false dichotomy. I was just up in Sacramento, a city that's doing huge amounts of multifamily infill, mid-rise multifamily infill in many cases, and they have probably one of the greatest tree canopies in California, maybe in the U.S. Of course, there are certain old, extremely mature trees that you want to have extra protections for. You want to have a requirement that new street trees get planted. At the same time, you don't want to have a tree ordinance that effectively makes any redevelopment impossible. I see a lot of communities that go overboard in one direction or the other. I think this is where the devil's in the details, and planners who are taking the trade-off seriously are in a position to be thoughtful about that. But I would say absolutely these things can be reinforcing. If we have rules on the books that say, well, we don't ever want a tree to be cut down, that's certainly not helping the environment. If you don't build a 300 unit 5/1 in downtown Sacramento, that's 300 new homes out on the periphery with many more trees cut down. But we can say, hey, look, we want to get this built, but also we want to protect our beautiful tree canopy and encourage more tree plantings. And to my mind, that's the reasonable approach.
Plus one, especially on the infill development, and turbocharge your infill development by looking at surface parking lots, especially combined with the parking demand management. If you see that there are a couple of surface parking lots in your inner urban core or your existing urban services area, that's a great opportunity to do that infill development. And then you can even layer on shipping container houses, manufactured housing, manufactured ADUs, manufactured tiny houses. So all of these little wins layered together can help with protecting that tree canopy, because you're not cutting down more trees to build more housing, or you're cutting down less. You're using existing infrastructure, existing surface parking lots. You're actually cutting down the urban heat island effect, because you're taking that impervious surface and you're making it into a development of some sort. And then when you cluster more density together, that also has an effect on decreasing the urban heat island. So all of these things kind of put together and package, and being mindful of where you're placing development versus Euclidean zoning, which is go keep sprawling, keep consuming greenfield development, manifest density, we can build until the end of the world, right? But now we're seeing we can't. And that type of development patterns is directly supercharging the urban heat island effect and decreasing tree canopy. A good example is like when you take I personally, I hate it when they take like a wooded lot and it's like full of oaks and they cut down all the oaks and they put up single family cul-de-sac development, and then they rename that development Scarlet Oak Grove. It's like, well, the oaks are gone. You cut them all down and replace them with houses. So just kind of reframing our mindset versus Euclidean zoning, which is the direct turbocharge to it, and kind of thinking more of using what we already have in that infill development and layering the interventions together can help with that.
Great, thank you. This last question, since we're running out of time, takes us back a little bit to the zoning question and the balance when you're talking about form-based codes or eliminating zoning codes altogether. How do we build in flexibility in places where there might be areas where we wouldn't want to put affordable housing, whether it's by a highway where air quality might not be very good, or near job producing activities like manufacturing or the Port of Baltimore, for example? How do we make sure that we're not encouraging unintended consequences of creating new environmental justice type impacts?
It's a great question. I'll take a first whack at it. I'm sure Takara has thoughts on this as well. To my mind, the land use policies we've had on the books, the focus of them has been to essentially segregate our cities and lock into law one form of living and one form of development. I think that's partly what Takara and I are criticizing today, but it's very much not an argument against land use planning. And indeed, to the extent that our zoning focuses on the wrong things, I think that's actually been a real cost. There really are concerns about land use compatibility, and you do need prudent regulations to protect folks from potentially having housing, especially affordable housing, sited in places with significant environmental risks. So, for example, even prior to zoning and in places like Houston, there are certain provisions for co-locating incompatible uses and keeping folks away from certain heavy industrial uses. I don't doubt that those rules could be stronger. At the same time, right, I think another approach to this issue is we have a lot of urban freeways that really are the significant quality of life issue. And in those cases, the actual solution might be, hey, do we actually need that urban freeway? In many cases, those freeways were built through historically marginalized communities where a lot of folks remain. And of course, it's good to not put all of the affordable housing within the vicinity of that, but there are folks who already live there whose quality of life is being harmed. And in that case, the most, I think, the wisest path would be to remove some of that infrastructure. We amortize nuisance uses all the time, and I think it's time that we start thinking that way about certain urban freeways that were built.
Definitely +1 on the racism of manufactured, industrial, environmental injustice uses being co-located and intentionally sited in Black and Brown communities, which is the irony of zoning, right? We say it was created to create the separation of uses and to protect human life, when actuality and reality and practice, we kind of did value Black and Brown Americans, and we intentionally placed those noxious uses in their neighborhoods, right? So I don't want to belabor that point. Nolan covered it very well. But then kind of adding on to it, number one, a form-based code is zoning. It's not Euclidean zoning. It is it's a regulation. So we are still regulating the built environment. And it is an intense, I will admit, intensive process. But the idea is you're capturing down with a very fine grain what the community wants into that regulation. So while you're walking away or relaxing discretionary review, you are still regulating the built environment. If a developer comes up to your counter and they're proposing a development that aligns with the form-based code, ostensibly, you should let them go ahead and do it because they followed the rules that are in place. And hopefully, when they actually bring those units out of the ground, it will align with that plan, right? So just kind of to wrap it up, I'm not advocating for getting rid of regulations altogether. I'm actually advocating for a more community-oriented, community-driven regulation that is more equitable and allows everybody to tap into the true American dream.
Thank you. That seems like a perfect spot to end. I will give each of you an opportunity to wrap up if there's anything else we didn't ask you about that you wanted to add. And I usually end by asking all of our speakers how, as professionals in the planning world, how do you stay optimistic and avoid the burnout that affects many people in our professions?
Sure, I'll start. I mean, as I said in my talk, I do this work because I think a better world is possible. I think if you don't believe that, I think you're in the wrong profession. That's what folks rely on us as planners, current and former, to provide, is a belief that we can build better communities. We don't have to live in this scarcity or zero-sum mindset, that we can create communities where everyone has housing choice, choice in how they get around, the ability to start a small business, to live and achieve their fullest potential. I think cities and communities are where that happens. We're social creatures. So that's abstract. More specifically, there is reform energy right now. I mean, it's not an accident that the Biden administration has made this one of their top issues. It's not an accident that governors and mayors and city council members all across the country are making this their top issue. This is where we need planners, engineers, architects, the practitioners, the developers, the experts in the room to be there to provide them with expertise and support. We need the activists to line up the coalitions. You know, these moments, these windows of opportunity to really reform policies, they come and go. They don't last forever. We might not be talking about this issue in 10 or 15 years. And I want us to look back at this period and say, wow, we really gave it our all, and we put our communities on so much more stronger footing from an environmental equity, affordability perspective. So, you know, I know this progress is slow. I can tell you, working with the legislature is no less frustrating at times than working in local communities. But the results are happening. I mean, when I took planning law, you know, almost a decade ago, my professor joked, two things are going to outlive nuclear apocalypse: cockroaches and single family zoning. Right? It was just unthinkable that we would get rid of single family zoning, or it was unthinkable that you would ever question parking requirements. And now look at where we're at, where this is almost common sense policy, and we're thinking, what comes next? So I would say the Overton window is getting wider. There's a huge opportunity here, but don't take it for granted. Push, be the leader that your community needs.
Thank you. Takara?
For me, what keeps me optimistic, two things. One, this is my why. It might sound cheesy, but literally getting up every day and knowing that I am talking about planning, I'm talking with people about planning, I'm writing plans, I'm seeing projects come out of the ground. That keeps me going. On another level, watching Gen Z and Gen Alpha come up and seeing their passion and their engagement, and really, to be frankly, their anger, I have a strong feeling that they're going to take this over the goal line. And I watch them, and that keeps me grounded, and that keeps me from burning out, because I'm opening the door for them like someone opened the door for me.
Right. Thank you so much. This has been a fantastic webinar, and the conversation is definitely inspiring. Unfortunately, this concludes our webinar, How Zoning Broke the American City and How to Fix It. I would like to offer my sincerest gratitude to Nolan and Takara for sharing their stories and for joining us today. Thank you to everyone who attended, and to John Coleman, who helps us make these webinars run smoothly. The complete recording of today's webinar will be posted online. When you exit today's webinar, you will be asked to participate in a short evaluation. Please take a few moments to provide feedback so we can continue to improve the webinar experience. Only those who indicated that they require a certificate during registration will be receiving one by email following the webinar. Please keep an eye on your email box for details on future webinars sponsored by the Maryland Department of Planning and the Smart Growth Network. Thank you for joining us, and have a great day.